In this video, we're going to get started creating a linkage. Thanks everybody for joining. It's been a little while since we posted a video and things have just gotten a bit busy. But we want to jump back into this series and we want to create a design. And so far what we've done is we've talked about the basics of getting Fusion. We've looked at the interface, basics of sketching, part creation. We looked at forms, and then we talked about the basics of assemblies. Now that was all building up to actually starting to design something. Now, as I mentioned earlier on in some of the videos, we really want to make sure that we focus on learning the tool and not just following along step by step with what I'm doing. So we're going to focus on creating a new design, and I want you to feel comfortable with what we're doing and be able to make your own changes. So we're going to start by creating a new empty untitled design. We are inside of our project Learn Everything in the Design series, so wherever you're saving your files, make sure that you're in that folder because it'll just be a little bit easier when we save our design. But anytime you launch Fusion, you're going to have a new untitled design ready for you. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to expand the document settings and take a look at the units. I'm going to change the active units by left-clicking on this icon, and it brings up a window that allows us to change these to several different types of units. We're going to focus on inch, and notice that Set as Default pops up, but we're just going to simply click OK. Now, if you normally work in metric files, then you want to leave metric as your default. If you normally work in the inch system, then you want to leave that as default as well. And a side note for you, if you go up to your user preferences, it is important to note that the user preferences for units is going to be different depending on where you are. So, for example, if we take a look at the design, the manufacturer, or even the electronics section and simulation, all of these have different units. So if you scroll down here, you see there is a unit and value display. Specifically for simulation, we can come in and we can change some of those options. And then below that, we have our default units. And again, design, manufacture, and simulation. So it's important to note that even if we change the unit in the design workspace where we are right now, it does not change in the manufacture workspace. So again, just a little thing, if you are constantly working on inch files, you might want to go into those preferences and simply change the default value so you don't have to remember to do it. You can of course change it at any point in time, and in dimension dialog boxes or anywhere that you're entering these values, you can simply put INCH instead of MM and it'll convert it for you. So now that we're set, we have our document settings, our inch set, we're going to create a new sketch. And we've talked about different ways that we can do this by selecting a plane, by selecting the Create Sketch first. And I'm going to again avoid using shortcuts, so I'm going to left click on Create Sketch. I'm going to start on the top plane, which in this case you'll notice that it doesn't say front, top, or side, but you can see there are different color axes here. So this is the XZ plane or the top plane, depending on how you want to look at it. From here we're going to begin to sketch. Now I did mention we're making linkage because we want to focus on something that we can do a simulation on, we want to be able to manufacture it, and we want to be able to create an assembly. So I'm going to start first by creating a basic linkage, and I'm going to start with a circle, a center diameter circle at the origin, and begin to drag this out. Now it's really handy if you notice the dialog box for the dimension is highlighted in blue and the cursor's flashing. This means that I can go ahead and I can enter a value. I'm going to put 1 for 1 inch, and then the icon changes to a lock icon. Now here's where it gets a bit tricky. When you're trying to work in Fusion and you want to remain efficient, if you hit the Enter key on the keyboard, not only does it enter that dimension, it gets off of the circle tool. So the way that we want to do this is we want to create a center diameter circle, and we'll go again back to the origin. I'm going to enter 1.5. and then simply click where you want that dimension to be. Now we're still on the circle tool. We don't have to make any changes. We can simply create another circle. And again, I'm just going to drag 2 circles over here, and I'm going to put a third set up here. And then to get off of that tool, we can do a few things. We can come up here, we can click, we can right click and say OK or cancel. We can hit escape on the keyboard twice. So these are all different ways that we can get off of that circle tool. Now that we have these three in place, we want to apply some constraints. Now it's always important that your designs are fully constrained. Right now, the two circles at the origin are black, and that means that they have constraints and dimension values that are fully defining them. However, the other sets are blue, which means that I can move them around freely in the canvas. When we look at this, there is a constraint that is applied, and this is a concentric constraint. This is done based on how we're sketching. Now, as you begin to sketch, if you don't like those applied, you can hold down the Control key, which will override those persistent constraints. But don't worry too much about that for now. If you ever want to get rid of one, you can select it, and you can hit delete on the keyboard, and then you no longer have that concentric constraint between them. I'm going to use Control Z to bring that back because I actually do want it there. So we want to constrain these in our environment. We want to figure out how they're supposed to be around each other. How we want to make sure if they are supposed to snap together, we do that. If they're supposed to remain in a certain alignment, we want to do that as well. So this can be done with construction geometry or simply with constraints. And when we apply constraints, we can do it a few different ways. We can select the items we want to constrain. So the center point here, Control or Shift select the center point here, and then we can see what our available options are. Horizontal, vertical, coincident, the lock or fix, and then we have over here collinear and symmetry. Now in this case, we want to use horizontal, vertical. Now it'll apply either horizontal or vertical, whichever it's closest to. So if I do a Control Z and I undo again, and I bring it back over here, and I repeat the process, and I use horizontal, vertical, now it's closer to vertical, so that's where it's going to be. Again, once more, I'll do Control Z and I'll bring it over here, and I'll just make it horizontal to the right side. With the second set of circles, these are not going to be horizontal or vertical, so creating a constraint to drive those is not going to work. What I want to do is I want to create some construction geometry to help me figure out where that should be. And there are several different ways that we can do this, but we're going to start with the line tool. And again, L on the keyboard is a shortcut for this if you like to use those. What I want to do is I want to create some construction geometry. I'm going to go between the center points of these two, and notice that it's automatically still on the line tool. And I don't want to draw a line from here just yet, so I'm going to click on the green check mark. I'm still on the line tool, so I'm going to come back until I see the triangle icon, which is our midpoint constraint. And then I'm going to draw this up and select the center point of that circle. And again, you can see that we're still on the line tool. I'm going to hit the green check mark, and then I'll hit escape to get off the line tool. So now we've applied some constraints simply by placing the line at a certain point, this midpoint. Now I can make this line vertical, or if I decide that there's some other relation that I want, if I need to have a specific angle between these two, or if instead of vertical, maybe I want them to always be perpendicular. So if this circle happens to come up, the relationship will be maintained. In this case, I'm going to use vertical, but these are the kinds of things that we want to think about when we're determining how our base sketch or the first sketch that we're creating is going to be essentially defined. I always want to make sure that I get off of these tools after I use them, so I'll hit escape in this case. It's a little bit quicker. These lines right now can be used for things like extruded surfaces. When I begin to close off the shape and make some profiles, it can be used for solid extrudes. And I don't really want that. I want this to maintain a reference. So with it selected, I'm going to come over to the construction option in the sketch palette, and I'll simply click that. I'll do the same thing for this one. And again, there are shortcut keys. X on the keyboard will allow us to do that as well. And the other option we have is as we begin to create the line, we can pre-select that, and then the line that gets created will automatically be construction. I don't really want to do that in this case, so make sure I turn that off, but just note that that is an available option. Now we have a few things that we need to do. We need to determine what the size of these circles are going to be. We know that we have an inch and a half over here, and if they want to be the same, then we can use the equal constraint. But there are a couple other ways that we can do this as well. So I'm going to start by using the equal constraint, and I'm going to go between the smaller circles and then the larger circles, and then we'll hit escape. The reason I want to hit escape here is because I want to show you another method, and that's going to be applying a dimension. So in this case, I'll go up to Sketch Dimension. Again, the shortcut key is D. And I'm going to start to drag a dimension here. I can manually enter the value of 1 inch, but really I want to make sure that my sketch is intelligent. If I modify one dimension, I don't want to have to go around and modify a bunch if they're going to be the same. So while that's still highlighted, I can come over here and I can click on the 1 inch dimension, and notice that it simply puts D1 in the sketch. I hit enter, it makes it 1 inch. I'll apply a dimension to the larger, and again, I'll just simply select the dimension I want it to be equal to, and I'll say OK or hit enter. Then I'm going to hit escape to get off the dimension tool for now because I want to point something out. Under the modify dropdown, there's something called change parameters. This allows us to create user parameters, things like bearing OD. So if this is a linkage, it likely has a bearing in it. Then I can enter the expression 1.00 or just 1, and this is going to be in the inch unit system. That's a user parameter that we can then link to other dimensions. If we expand the stuff down here, we get into the sketch and we get into the dimensions, you can see here that D1 is 1 inch, D2 is 1.5. And then we have these other values, D3 and D4, that are linked to D1 and D2. So it shows us in the back end that these values are automatically getting a name applied to them, D1, D2. And by linking them, we're putting an expression in there that tells it anytime we change this 1 inch value, let's say to 1.25, the other value, in this case D1, is going to change as well. So it's a great way for us to predefine some values in our design, things like draft angle or specific values for hole patterns. These are all the kinds of things that we can predefine that make it easier when we're sketching. So let's say that I decided that I didn't want these to be equal. I'm going to come back, select these constraints, and hit delete. I'm going to come back and begin to create this dimension. Now I know that this is going to be called bearing OD, so I start typing that in, and notice that the parameter is available. I click on it, hit enter, and now it's applied. So this means that the bearing OD, or the value, is going to be controlled by that parameter. And then we can also create a dimension, let's say, between the two that's offset, and we can simply manually enter a value. I'm not going to say that there is a right or a wrong way to go about this, but there are certainly benefits and drawbacks depending on what you're modeling. If you have a design that is molded, for example, you're going to have a universal draft angle that you're going to want to apply. Maybe it's different on the outside if there's a texture. You're going to have a wall thickness that you want to use. You're going to have other values that are going to be consistent throughout the design. These types of things are very easily controlled in user parameters because no matter how many sketches or features they show up in, you can modify that in one place. Same thing with linking these values. This allows you to come back and modify a sketch in one place without having to go to many different sketches or many different dimensions to modify your design. To finish this sketch off, we need to add a few more entities, but we want to make sure that, again, it's fully defined. So I'm going to bring this down, and I'm going to make this a distance of 5 inches. And then I'm going to give this a value of 5, and I'm going to do some math in this box. Divided by 2. And now it's going to be equal to 2.5. And again, this is another way that we can drive the design. If I decide to make this 6 inches, it automatically makes this 3 inches. If I make it smaller, it's going to be using that value and then dividing it by 2. Anytime we want to change that, we can do it directly in here by double-clicking on this value, or we can go back in to modify, change parameters, and even though this was done in the dimensions in the sketch, you can see that we can modify that value, D8, and let's say that we want to divide it by 2.5. So we can modify those parameters at any point in time. It's quick and easy. The last thing that we want to do is make a complete closed profile. And there are several different ways that we can do this. I'm going to use the line tool, and I'm going to simply just draw lines between each of these outside diameters. And then we need to make some design decisions. So the design decisions are going to be whether or not we want those to be tangent to the outside circle, or if we want them to be offset a certain amount. It really depends on the design. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to select this tangent and delete it. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Those are persistent constraints that are automatically applied. And then I need to decide how I want to drive this. Again, there are several different ways that we can do this, but I'm going to use the line tool for construction, and I'm going to go simply between the center point of each of these. And then I'll hit escape to get off that tool, turn off construction, and then I'm going to use my parallel constraint. I'm going to make these parallel, and these both have a horizontal or some sort of constraint already applied, so it's not required down here. But if we wanted to get rid of this horizontal and drive it as parallel, again, depending on how the design might update, we can do that. Now we need to give it some sort of dimension. So again, I'm going to come into my dimension tool, and I'm going to figure out what I want this distance to be. In this case, I'm going to say 0.75. Another great instance of using these linked values by selecting the dimension to drive this. And we'll do the same thing here. So now if I decide to change this, 0.625, it'll bring those values in. If I want to keep it at 0.75, I can modify that one value and not have to worry. So these are not going to be tangent with the outside diameters, but they're slightly offset. So this allows us to add, for example, a fillet between the intersection. Now as we look at this, this is not going to be the best way for us to create the sketch because we've got this small overlap section. We can use tools like the trim tool, which are found in modify, and we can trim this section out. When we do that, you'll see a warning pop up because of the constraints applied. But in this case, it's going to be okay because it automatically repairs those for us. We're using a parallel constraint and an offset value for this dimension. So there's nothing that really needs to be adjusted or fixed. It's just telling us that the constraint where it was initially applied, where this point was intersecting with the circle, has changed. So now we have a complete closed profile that we can extrude the inside section as well as these outside bosses that are going to be used for pivot points on our link. There's obviously more that we could do. We could relieve some material in the center, and that's really not something we'll know until we do a simulation. But for right now, we want to finish the sketch. And before we create a solid, I'm going to select the Fit to Screen to put it back in the center, and I want to save this design. So I'm going to call this Lead Linkage. Keep in mind that this design, Lead Linkage, is going to be the entire assembly. We're going to add a few extra components. We're going to create extra bodies and things like that. So we're going to use it as the basis for our design. But for right now, we have it saved, so this is a great point for us to stop and move on to the next video.